The laughter started before Eli Mercer got both boots out of the truck. It was 8:10 on an April morning in 1983, and the gravel lot outside Two Forks Feed and Seed in Shannon County, Missouri, was already crowded with pickups, grain sacks, and men holding paper cups of coffee they had no intention of finishing. Eli was 66 years old. He moved slow because one knee had never forgiven him for a logging accident in 1959, and because he believed a man who hurried around livestock usually ended up repairing what he had scared. Behind his truck, hooked to a dented two-horse trailer with one red fender and one gray fender, were 15 goats. Not dairy goats, not show goats. 15 narrow-headed, rough-coated Spanish brush goats with yellow eyes, hard feet, and a habit of looking at every fence like it was a personal insult. That was what made the men laugh. Ray Slayton saw them first. Ray was 32, newly married, newly licensed, and newly convinced that every farm problem in the Ozarks could be solved with the right tank mix and a receipt. He had parked his white 3/4-ton truck beside the front door so everybody could see the sprayer rig in the bed. When Eli stepped down from the cab, Ray called across the lot. "Mercer, the stock sale is 20 miles east." A few men smiled. Then Ray looked at the trailer again and raised his coffee cup. "Unless those goats learn to read herbicide labels, you brought the wrong equipment." That got the laugh he wanted. Eli didn't answer right away. He reached into the cab, took out a coil of electric polywire, and laid it across the tailgate. Then he looked at Ray, then at the men gathered around him. "They don't need to read," Eli said. "They just need to come back hungry." Nobody in that parking lot understood what he meant. Not Ray with his clean boots and spray charts. Not Otis Bell, whose pasture shared Eli's south fence, and whose face had gone tight every time the wind blew seed across the line. Not Mason Croft, the young man who shook his head like he was watching a kind old fool embarrass himself in public. They saw 15 goats in a trailer. They did not see the calendar Eli had already built in his head. They did not see the root reserves under the soil. They did not see the pressure he was about to put on a weed that everyone else had decided could only be poisoned. Eli Mercer had owned 122 acres along Black Gum Hollow since 1954. The place had never been easy land. It was Ozark ground, limestone knobs, thin soil, cedar breaks, and creek bottom patches that could grow good grass if a man respected how fast water came and went. Eli had bought the farm with savings from a sawmill job and 2 years of hauling railroad ties. His wife, June, used to say the land had more rocks than sense. But she also said rocks stayed where you put them, which made them more dependable than people. They raised 3 children there, sold calves when prices allowed, cut hay in fields too small to make anyone rich, and kept a kitchen garden that fed better than the pasture did. June died in 1978 after a winter sickness that started as a cough and ended with Eli sitting beside a hospital bed in Springfield, holding her wedding ring because her fingers had grown too thin to keep it on. After that, Eli got quieter. He did not become bitter. He did not start telling long stories in town. He just listened more closely to things other men talked over. That was how he first noticed the Sericea. Sericea Lespedeza had been planted in parts of the county years earlier to hold poor soil. On paper, it sounded useful. It covered bare ground. It survived drought. It grew where better forage gave up. But in a pasture, once it settled in, it did not behave like a guest. It came up stiff and wiry in the spring. By summer it stood waist-high in pale green stems cattle picked around unless they were starving. By fall it carried seed like trouble in its pockets, scattering next year's problem with every mower pass, every flood, every bird, and every careless load of hay. Eli found the first patch on his lower ridge in 1981. At the time, it was no bigger than a kitchen table. He cut it, burned the clippings, and told himself he had caught it early. He had not. By the spring of 1983, the ridge pasture had changed color. A rough band of Sericea ran from the old pond dam across nearly 11 acres of slope and into the edge of the hay ground. The cattle had grazed the fescue and orchard grass around it, leaving the Sericea standing taller and thicker, which made the whole field look like the weed had risen on purpose while everything useful had stepped aside. The county extension man told Eli what he already knew. Established Sericea would not leave because a farmer wished it gone. Spraying would take more than one season. He would have to hit the regrowth at the right window, watch the weather, protect the creek draw, reseed bare areas, and come back again when the root crowns pushed new stems. The written estimate came to just under $5,000 across 2 years. $5,000 in 1983 did not sound like a repair. It sounded like a warning. Eli folded the paper once, then again, put it into his shirt pocket, and drove home with both hands on the wheel. Ray Slayton heard about it within 3 days. In farm country, bad pasture is not private. It has fence lines. It has neighbors. It has men at the feed store who say they're only asking because they care. Ray showed up at Eli's gate the following Friday in the white truck with the sprayer in the back and boots so clean they looked borrowed. He walked the ridge with a clipboard. Eli walked 3 steps behind him, saying almost nothing. Ray stopped at the worst patch, bent a stem between 2 fingers, and let it snap back. "This is an established stand," Ray said. "You let this seed 1 more year. It will walk right into your hay ground. Cattle won't touch enough of it to matter." Eli nodded. Ray took the nod as surrender. "I can put you on the schedule before first bloom, then again after regrowth. It will not be cheap, but it will be cheaper than letting that field turn useless." Eli looked past him toward the cedar line. Near the old pond dam, where a neighbor's goats had broken through for 2 afternoons the year before, The Sericea looked different, shorter, ragged, not dead, but interrupted. The stems there were clipped at odd angles. The grass underneath had light in it. Eli had been looking at that patch for 3 weeks. Ray had walked past it twice. "I have another way to start," Eli said. Ray glanced up from the clipboard. "What way?" "Goats. There are laughs that come from cruelty, and there are laughs that come from confidence. Ray's was the second kind, which made it harder to answer. "Goats will nibble brush," Ray said. "I'll give you that. But they are not going to clean 11 acres of established Sericea. That plant is tough because of what you cannot see: crown, root, seed bank. You will watch goats chew the top off while the stand rebuilds underneath." "Only if I let it rebuild," Eli said. Ray closed his clipboard. "Eli, this is not 1930. "No," Eli said. "That's why I bought better wire." The next Tuesday was the morning Eli brought the goats to Two Forks Feed and Seed. He had come to pick up 2 sacks of mineral, a 6-volt fence battery, and a second reel of polywire he had borrowed from a widow named Mrs. Cagle, who kept it hanging in her smokehouse because her late husband had never thrown away anything that still had a job left in it. But by the time Eli backed the trailer to the loading area, the story had already arrived before him. Ray made sure of that. "Fellas," he said, loud enough for the men by the porch posts to hear, "Eli's going to turn a weed problem into a petting zoo." Mason Croft stepped closer to the trailer and looked through the slats. "Those things will eat the leaves off your blackberry bushes and stand on your truck hood," he said. "But they will not save that ridge." Eli lifted the latch on the trailer door, then stopped. For the first time that morning, his voice sharpened just enough for every man to hear it. "I am not asking them to save it." The laughing thinned. "I am asking them to weaken it. Then I am asking them again before it catches its breath." He closed the latch, loaded the battery, and drove home. That afternoon, Eli did not turn the goats loose across the ridge. That was what the men at the feed store imagined, because that was how most people imagine livestock doing a job. Open the gate, hope for the best, complain when hope wanders into the neighbor's beans. Eli had no use for that kind of hope. He walked the entire infestation, first with a carpenter's pencil behind one ear and June's old church notebook in his hand. The first 7 pages still had her handwriting in them: pie crust, lamp oil, socks for Ben, postage. Eli started his records on page 8. He marked 3 zones. The pond dam was the source. Moist soil, heavier stand, early green growth, dense crowns. The ridge middle was the spread. Thinner soil, more exposed, plants tall but less rooted. The hay edge was the danger. If the Sericea crossed there, he would not just lose rough pasture, he would lose the part of the farm that paid the winter feed bill. He began at the pond dam, not because it was easy, because it was where the weed was strongest. Eli set the first temporary paddock at a little under 1 acre. He pushed fiberglass posts into rocky soil every 12 paces, strung polywire low enough for goats to respect and high enough not to catch every stone, clipped the wire to the fence energizer, and waited for the first bright snap to prove the current was alive. Then he backed the trailer to the gate. The goats came out in a tight bunch, suspicious of the new ground, their hooves clicking on stones. For 10 minutes they walked the fence. For 20 they tested it. The smallest doe touched the wire with her nose, jumped backward like the devil himself had tapped her, and decided the boundary was real. Only then did they begin to feed. At first they reached for grass. Eli expected that. He had not brought them there because Sericea was dessert. He had brought them there because, when confined with the right pressure and no easier buffet, goats would strip tender Sericea leaves, nip new stems, and keep the plant from doing the one thing it needed most: recovering. A big brown doe with one torn ear took the first serious bite. She leaned sideways, avoided the stiffest stem, and peeled the leaves clean. Another followed, then another. By evening, the front edge of the patch had changed texture. Not gone, changed. That was enough for the first day. For the first 3 weeks, it looked like Ray might be right. The goats ate. Eli rotated them every 3 to 4 days. He hauled water in old cream cans because the ridge trough sat too far from the paddocks. He moved wire before breakfast and checked it after supper. He kept the goats tight enough to force pressure, but not so tight they stripped every good blade to the dirt. And still, the Sericea came back. By late May, the first paddock had fresh green shoots pushing through the ragged stems. Some of them looked stronger than before. Eli stood at the fence on a humid evening while thunderheads gathered beyond the cedar ridge, and for the first time he let the number on the extension estimate come back into his mind. $5,000. Then he thought of the hay edge. Then he thought of Ray's laugh. Worst of all, he thought of June's notebook in his pocket, and how foolish it would feel to fill those pages with a failure. That night, a storm broke hard over Black Gum Hollow. Rain hit the tin roof sideways. The creek rose brown and loud. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Eli woke because the sound outside the house had changed. Not thunder, bells. He kept small brass bells on 3 of the goats, because goats without bells are just trouble making plans in silence. Eli pulled on boots, grabbed a flashlight, and went out into rain so heavy it turned the porch steps silver. The lower wire had sagged where runoff carried a limb into it. 6 goats were outside the paddock, standing on the wrong side of the fence, chewing calmly on the very grass he had meant to protect. Eli's bad knee slipped in the mud before he reached them. He went down hard, one hand in gravel, flashlight rolling, rain running under his collar. For a moment he stayed there. The goats chewed. The creek roared. The old house behind him was dark. That was the lowest point of the whole fight. though nobody in town saw it. Not the laughing at the feed store, not Ray's clipboard, not the estimate. It was Eli Mercer, alone in the rain, with one knee in the mud, and 6 goats proving that even an old answer can fail if the man using it gets careless. He got up. He fixed the wire in the rain. He put the goats back. And before he went inside, he walked to the first paddock with the flashlight and looked at the regrowth that had made him doubt himself. The new shoots were tender, short, exactly the kind of growth the goats would hit harder the second time. Eli understood then that he had been looking for death too soon. He did not need the Sericea to disappear in May. He needed it to spend energy making leaves, spend it again making leaves, spend it again before it could build seed, spend until the root crowns had nothing left to lend. The next morning he changed the schedule. He shortened the rest interval on the pond dam paddocks. He brought the goats back before the new stems hardened. He left the ridge middle longer because the dry soil slowed recovery. He watched the hay edge like a loaded gun. Every Tuesday and Friday he recorded 3 things in June's notebook: stem height before grazing, stem height 10 days later, seed heads present or absent. The words were plain: pond dam, second pass, 8 inches down to 2, no seed. Ridge middle, first pass, 15 inches down to 4, light regrowth. Hay edge, watch close, do not let bloom. By June, the goats had learned the job. They no longer wandered the paddock looking insulted by limited choices. They moved as a line. Leaves first, tender stems next. Tall stalks only after the easy parts were gone. Eli learned too. He learned that the brown doe with the torn ear led the others into the thickest patches. He learned the goats worked best in the cool of morning and again before dusk. He learned that if he left them half a day too long, they punished the grass. If he moved them half a day too early, the Sericea kept too much strength. Pressure, he wrote once in the margin, not panic. By early July, the ridge had begun to show a difference a man could pretend not to see, only if pride required it. Otis Bell was the first neighbor to notice. He had been worried about that south fence since March. On a Wednesday afternoon, he rode his tractor to the boundary, pretending to inspect a loose brace post. From there, he could see the pond dam patch. He took off his cap. The Sericea was still there, but it no longer owned the ground. Between the pale stems, clover and grass had begun to show. The oldest stalks stood brown and bitten, not cleanly mowed, but worried down, interrupted again and again until they looked less like a stand of weeds and more like the remains of an argument. Otis said nothing in town that day. He came back Friday, then Sunday. By the third visit, Eli saw him and raised one hand from the far side of the paddock. Otis raised his back. No speech needed. The pasture was doing the talking. Ray Slayton heard anyway. By late August, the talk at Two Forks Feed and Seed had changed shape. Men who had laughed in April now spoke in lower voices. They did not say Eli was right, not yet. That would have cost too much pride. They said things like, "I hear the ridge looks better," or "Goats do like brush, I always knew that," or "Sericea is lighter this year all over because of the weather." Ray held his line the longest. He told anyone who asked that one season did not prove control. He said the crowns would rebound. He said the seed bank was still there. He said a field could look better in September and still come back mean in May. Some of that was true. That was what made Ray dangerous. He was not foolish. He knew enough to sound right. But Eli knew the field, and the field was changing. On the second Saturday of September, Eli went into town for goat mineral and fence staples. Ray was at the counter, flipping through a parts catalog. Mason Croft stood near the feed sacks. Otis Bell sat on an overturned bucket by the stove, though the stove was cold. Ray looked up when Eli came in. "Eli," he said, "fall window is coming. If you want to finish that Sericea properly, I can still get you on a spray day before frost." The store quieted. Eli set the mineral sack on the counter. "I believe I will pass." Ray's mouth tightened. "Eli, you grazed it. You did not kill it. There is a difference." "There is," Eli said. He took June's notebook from his shirt pocket and laid it on the counter. "But before you sell me a death certificate, you ought to look at the patient." No one laughed that time. Ray drove out that afternoon. He parked at Eli's gate and walked to the ridge alone. Eli watched from the porch, then poured 2 cups of coffee and followed without hurry. The September light lay low across Black Gum Hollow, showing every weakness and every recovery. The pond dam patch, the worst part of the field in April, was not clean. Eli had never claimed it was. But it was broken. The Sericea stood thin, chewed, and uneven. Where it had once made a solid pale wall, there were gaps wide enough for grass to fill. The plants that had been hit 4 times were stunted close to the crown. Most had made no seed. Some crowns had gone brittle and dead at the center. The ridge middle was better. The hay edge was the proof. There, where the farm's winter feed money had been at risk, orchard grass had pushed back in strips so bright they looked painted. Ray stood with his hands on his hips for a long time. "How many passes?" he asked. "4 on the pond dam, 3 through the ridge, 2 and a quick cleanup on the hay edge." Ray crouched and touched one of the bitten stems. "You kept them off the grass better than I thought you could." "I learned after they taught me what happens if I don't." Ray almost smiled at that, but not quite. He looked across the slope again. "This will need another year." "Yes," Eli said. "And you still have seed in the ground?" "Yes." Ray stood. "But you stopped this year's seed." Eli handed him the coffee. "That was the first job." Ray took the cup. There was no apology, not in the usual words. Men like Ray did not often know how to hand over a clean apology without feeling as if they had also handed over their spine. So he gave Eli the closest thing he had. "Your timing was better than my estimate." Eli looked at the ridge. "No," he said. "The goat's timing was better. I just moved the fence." The second year did what the first year had promised. In April of 1984, Eli hit the pond dam patch early, while the Sericea was still soft and spending its first flush of growth. He did not wait for it to look like a problem. He treated it like one before it had an audience. By June, the worst crowns were weak. By August, the hay edge had more grass than weed. By October, the ridge pasture was still rough Ozark ground, still thin in places, still no picture for a seed catalog. But it was pasture again. Eli had spent money. Of course he had. Fence posts, batteries, mineral, hoof work, winter hay for the goats. Time nobody counted because old farmers rarely count their own time honestly. But he had not written a $5,000 check to surrender the field for 2 years and hope the weather cooperated. He had built a system that kept working every time the goats stepped into a new paddock hungry. The next spring, Mason Croft came to Eli's gate with his hat in his hand. He had a smaller patch starting along a creek bottom. He did not mention the laughter. Eli did not mention it either. They walked Mason's field together for an hour. Eli showed him the stage to hit, the height to watch, the mistake of waiting for flowers, the danger of leaving goats too long just because a man liked seeing weeds disappear. "Don't graze for revenge," Eli told him. "Graze for pressure." Mason wrote that down. After that, more men came. Not all at once. Pride slows traffic. But they came. Otis borrowed a reel. Mrs. Cagle got her polywire back with 2 new insulators tied to it. Even Ray Slayton began telling customers that brush goats could be part of a control plan if a man had the fence, the time, and the discipline not to turn them loose like a joke. He still sold herbicide. Eli still bought lime from him. The county did not change overnight. No county ever does. Clean boots did not vanish from the feed store. Spray rigs did not stop humming down gravel roads. Nobody wrote an article about Eli Mercer in the paper. But men who had once laughed at 15 goats in a trailer began to look longer at the ground before deciding what it needed. And that was the part Eli cared about. Because the lesson had never been that chemicals were evil, or that old ways were always better, or that a goat was wiser than a licensed man with a clipboard. The lesson was smaller than that, and harder. A field does not care who sounds modern. A weed does not care who laughs. The land only answers what returns with enough patience, enough timing, and enough pressure. That spring, standing on the ridge where the grass had come back through the scars, Eli opened June's notebook and wrote one last line under 2 years of dates, heights, rain marks, and hard lessons. Pasture holding. Then he closed the notebook, whistled once, and the goats lifted their heads from the next paddock as if they had been waiting for the next order. The pasture remembered the pressure long after the laughter was gone.